Hey everyone, I'm Kevin with Victory 4x4. In today's video, we're going to be installing our engine, transmission, and transfer case skid system on our 2023 ZR2 Chevy Colorado. Now right here we have a Z71 package truck, but this is going to correlate with a few different options packages. Basically what we're going to do here is remove this lower air dam, this plastic splash shield, and the small metal skid plate under here. So because it's right in front of us and obvious, I grabbed a 7mm socket and we're going to remove the 10 screws along the front edge here where this black plastic kind of meets the bottom of this gray plastic. With those out of the way, we'll move kind of in here inside of this inner wheel opening area where it does get just a little bit harder to see, but you have a couple clips and one more screw on each side that needs to be removed. As for the bolt, you're still going to use that 7mm socket, and it's going to be the small hex bolt furthest out here toward the end. You'll have one on each side again. Next, you have two clips that need to be removed. They're in each of these kind of tabbed locations running up into the painted front fascia or bumper assembly. They are a little bit tricky to access, but they can be reached pretty well with a 90-degree style pick like I have here. If you're having any trouble, you can grab a T15 Torx and remove the few bolts holding the bottom edge of this inner fender to give you some extra room to access there. The clips look just like the one I have here, and essentially what you're looking to do is hook it with your pick, and then you can press down and pull back, releasing it from the plastic tab in this fascia and slide it out of its location, bringing this up from the bumper. So what that should look like in real time is reaching up between here, finding that tab and pressing down and back to release it from that clip. To gain access to the second one, you're just going to be using this hole in the fender liner here, and you can reach in and repeat the same process. With all that hardware removed, this is now essentially free from the vehicle. You just have to kind of pull it out from behind this plastic trim here and work it out around the tow hooks, and it can be removed. Now if you want to, you can go back through and reinstall the hardware into here. It's not necessary to hold anything in, but it may prevent these clips from rattling over time. And we can then move into removing this lower splash shield. For that, you want to start out with some sort of clip tool. You can probably even do these with a flat blade screwdriver if that's what you have, but it's going to be held in along the front edge here with 5 clips, so 3 right here toward the center and 1 out on each end. For this, you just need to get behind the center portion of the clip and kind of pop it down first. You can then get behind the entire clip and remove it from the vehicle. You'll then need a 13mm socket. Here we're going to be removing the 5 bolts remaining holding this plastic skid in place. You can leave these outside 2 toward the back for now, and we'll take them off in just a moment. Similar to that first plastic piece, it's going to be kind of tucked up behind this gray plastic, so you got to make sure to pull it down around that, and then you can slide it out around the tow hook. Once you've done that on both sides, you should be able to slide it pretty much straight forward and off of the truck. Then we can come back and remove those last 2 bolts. Again, with that 13, just make sure you're supporting the stamped steel skid when you take out the final bolt. So that's all there is to disassemble on this Z71. You'll see the remainder of this install happen on our ZR2 that we have here at the shop. If there are any minor differences, we'll be sure to call those out along the way. Here on this ZR2, we're first going to remove this front aluminum skid plate. It's got 7 fasteners holding it in, 4 of which are going to be Torx head bolts, kind of in these locations. For that, you'll need a T40 Torx to go ahead and remove those. You'll then grab a 13mm socket to remove the remaining 3 bolts across roughly the center of the skid here. Just make sure when you pull the final bolt out on this that you have this somewhat supported.
Then sticking with that 13 mil socket, you can come back here and remove this front differential skid plate. This is held in with 5 bolts, 2 right here in the front and 3 along the back. With these front cutouts being slotted, you can kind of just loosen these two. And then go back and remove all 3 across the rear. That'll give this a little bit of support while you get those out. And then you can slide this off and come back and take those bolts out. You'll remove this center metal skid or guard, if you will, as well. It's got 2 bolts here on the bottom. The other 2 are going to be found behind these plastic covers here on the lower section of the bumper. So you'll need a pry tool to get these removed. I have a plastic pry tool here just to try and protect the plastic on the truck. We're just going to pry from the bottom. And once you get this out, it should kind of fall straight down. It does have a small retaining tab there, and then you'll reach kind of straight back in here with your 13 and an extension to remove that bolt. Once you have both of those removed, you should be able to pull this straight down. Now on this rear cross member, you'll see 3 clip nuts that secured the factory skid and the factory hardware threaded into. If you're only installing our engine skid, you can go ahead and leave those in place and just bolt the skid in using the factory hardware. If you're going to be running our engine skid and a transmission skid, in which case you have to stack them, you're not going to have enough thread length in those factory bolts, so you're going to want to remove these and use the 5/16 hardware that we provide. So to get these out, you just need a flat screwdriver or even a pick to get up in here. You'll kind of pry the center locking tab down and then pull this right out of its hole location. The clip nuts we provide are very similar, and they're going to install in essentially the same fashion, so you'll just slide these back into each of those locations and snap them in. You can now grab your engine skid and raise it up to the front of the truck. We're doing this with a transmission jack since we're working here on a lift, but you can do the same thing with a floor jack in your driveway if that's how you're going to install yours. You want to have your factory hardware in hand, at least for these front 3 bolts at this time. So if you remember correctly from the disassembly, that's the 3 hex bolts that run along the front here. So you can start each of these by hand. Moving back toward the center of the skid, you can install the hardware in these 4 hole locations. Now if you remember right, this was hex bolts on the outside and Torx fasteners toward the center. You will now, after replacing the back hardware with 5/16, have some extra hex bolts left over if you want to make these all the same, but that's entirely up to you. Now your 5/16 hardware back here is the 5/16 by 1¼ inch long hex bolt with a washer. That's going to go into the clip nuts in all 3 of these slotted holes. Now if you're only installing the engine skid at this time, you can install all 3 of these and now go back through and tighten up your mounting hardware. If you're continuing on with a transmission skid like we are, you're just going to install the center one, as the front holes on that transmission skid have a slotted hole there to allow it to slide in and kind of overlap on the top side of this skid. Additionally, one small detail that I really should have pointed out earlier on, but some of you, specifically with a non-ZR2 truck, are likely not going to have any factory clip nuts in this back location, as you don't have the same skid plate across the center under the diff here. So you will just simply install the 5/16 clip nuts in these 3 locations. Now here is a look at the skids installed on our Canyon AT4. So specifically the engine skid up here is going to look a little bit different than the ZR2 skid. However, the installation is going to be exactly the same as far as hardware and mounting goes. And then back here on the mid skid as well as the transfer case skid, again, same thing goes. They're going to mount
identical to what you're going to see us install on our ZR2, but as you can tell, they look quite a bit different. That's due to the provisions and cutouts for these underbody cameras that this Canyon AT4 is equipped with. So pay close attention to your truck, whether or not you have these, and select the appropriate menu options on the drop-down list when ordering your skids. So this is your transmission skid, obviously well ventilated. The 3-hole side is going to go toward the front of the truck. So here you can see that slot that is going to slide on to that rear bolt on the engine skid. And then the 4 bolts here will bolt to the cross member up on the truck.
We've updated the skid to come in 2 pieces now. And the first step that you'll have to do is bolt them together using these 1/2-inch carriage bolts and 1/2-inch flange nuts at the 3 mounting points. With all 3 of the bolts installed, you can tighten the nuts up and then continue with the rest of the installation. If you're installing the camera compatible version of this skid, you'll need to assemble the 2 main halves together in the same way with the carriage bolts supplied, but there will be a 3rd piece that needs to get installed with 6 3/8 by 1-inch button head bolts and flange nuts. Once all the hardware is installed, the 3 carriage bolts and the 6 button heads, making sure that the skids overlap, you can go ahead and tighten up all of the hardware at once.
Now back here at the transmission mount cross member, you're going to see this transfer case skid, which if you didn't purchase our transfer case skid at the same time as your transmission skid and want to retain this, you can. You'll simply install our skid over top of the factory skid here. We do recommend at least removing this temporarily and replacing the factory metric clip nuts with our 5/16 bolts and clip nuts here in these 2 locations. And that will again just require that 13mm socket on the 2 bolts here, as well as the 2 at the rear of this skid. So these clip nuts will remove just like the ones up front. So grab your screwdriver and pop these out here. You can then snap the new provided 5/16 clip nuts into those 2 locations, as well as the 2 round hole locations over on the passenger side of this same cross member. Since we are installing our full skid system, including our transfer case skid, we're going to leave that factory one out of the way, and we can now get our trans skid up on the jack and start installing some hardware. For this step, you will need to have the engine skid loose enough that you can slide the trans skid up over top and line up that center slot. You can then slide that forward until you can install the 2 remaining 5/16 bolts out on each side. Now across the back here, you're just using 4 more of those 5/16 by 1.25" long hex bolts. So go ahead and start each of these by hand. With all 4 bolts started back here, you can leave these loose if you're continuing on with your TK skid install, as you will want to slide that up over top of the transmission skid here, just like we did with this and the engine skid. If you're done with your install at this point and you're ready to tighten things up, you'll need a 1/2-inch socket. You'll first, at the rear back here, want to tighten up the 2 center bolts, and then come back and just snug up those outside 2, drawing them tight to the skid plate. From there, you can go back up front and tighten the 3 bolts up there. So moving on to the TK skid, here you can get a quick look at it. So the front edge has those 2 slots on the outside bolts that I mentioned earlier on. You do have a couple extra holes in here. Essentially, that's just so this can be a mirrored part for us from a production standpoint. So pay attention there when you're lining this up, and don't be too concerned about those. Before we get this installed, there's just a couple bolts we have to loosen and one to remove there in the back by the evap canister. So we'll show you that now. So this is your factory evap canister mounting bracket. This is what we need to loosen up to get the skid installed, as it's going to sit up tight to this cross member, and then this will bolt back in underneath. So here on the front, you just have 1 bolt that you can remove with your 13. And then out here on the side, we've got a couple nuts that are actually kind of buried down inside of the frame rail that need to be just loosened up to allow this to drop free, so you're not prying on this plastic bracket. So moving out here to the side of the frame, you're going to be reaching inside of this hole and this one up here inside of the body mount. These are the two larger holes in this location. You'll still use your 13 mil socket here. Obviously it's a little hard to see as you're reaching down in the frame from a filming standpoint, but you can look inside of there and pretty easily see the nut on the stud that passes through the frame. The reason we switched to a ratchet here is because we just want to loosen these and not accidentally remove them all the way off of their stud, and you're in a little bit tight quarters with your factory slider or skid here. So go ahead and loosen these up. So again, just make sure that you don't back those off so much that you drop the nut down into the frame, and make sure you have a decent gap here to slide your skid up into place. So taking your TK skid, you can now slide it in, starting up over the top of the back of that transmission skid and making sure you get it above this evap bracket. Make sure during this step you only have the outside two mounting bolts in on the back of that transmission skid, since those are your slotted mounting holes. And then work this across. And once it's lined up on those bolts, you should be able to slide it forward, lining up the slots back here. To make sure you have this properly lined up, you can now start reinstalling your factory hardware across the back here. Following that, you'll install the two remaining 5/16 hex head bolts with washers. These two are going to pass through the transfer case and transmission skid and thread into those 5/16 clip nuts that you would have installed earlier on. Once you have all your hardware at least loosely started by hand, you can tighten up just a couple of the bolts back here to kind of hold this skid in place. And then on the remaining two holes over here on the passenger side, we're going to be using the skid as a guide to mark and drill and install two 3/8 self-tapping bolts. Now on this passenger side rear corner, you're going to be marking and drilling in these two slotted holes. The round hole here in the center is kind of leftover or extra at this point, so disregard that. To mark these out, you can use a marker, you can use a center punch, you can use a spring punch like I have here, or a punch and a hammer. It's really up to you and what tools you have available to you. Now I mentioned we're using the skid as a guide. If you want to, if you're worried about damaging the powder coat finish on your skid, you could pull it back down once you have those marked and then drill and reinstall it before getting your self-threading bolts in place. But we're just going to kind of be as cautious as possible here. With it marked out, we grabbed an 1/8 inch drill bit to drill a pilot hole in the center. From there, the 3/8 thread cutting bolts require a 5/16 hole, so you can use a conventional 5/16 drill bit, or we really like step bits or unibits like I have here. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with this. I may find as I drill this in that it's a little bit too long for the width of this cross member. So if it makes contact with the back side of that, I'll just switch to this and finish out that hole. The thread cutting bolts are pretty easy to identify by the cutting edge in the front of the threaded portion here and the flanged hex head. To get these installed, you'll need a 9/16 socket and ideally an impact. You'll then just apply pressure as you start that up into the hole here and run it in with the impact, cutting new threads into this cross member. Once you have both of those started and you're happy with the result, we can now work our way back through and tighten up and double check all the alignment and hardware throughout our entire skid system. Additionally, don't forget to go back and tighten up that outside mounting hardware for the evap canister on that outside edge of the frame. Now back up here on the engine skid to kind of finish up this install, we also provide you these black plastic caps. These are going to go in all the round holes for the recessed mounting hardware, just to, again, clean up the appearance of the skids and the installation and kind of smooth out the look of that. Specifically on these kind of front outside two holes, one on each side, you want to pay close attention when snapping these in, as the mounting bracket that's recessed in here gets pretty close to this hole during the manufacturing process. So when you snap this in, if for any reason it is sticking out at all and not sitting nice and flush, you may just have to carefully sand down the edge of it, just making sure not to sand anywhere that the kind of locking tabs for this plug are located. At that point, once all your hardware is tight and your plugs are installed, this installation is pretty much complete. So if you guys have any questions at all about this install or really anything else we offer here at Victory 4x4, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always send us an email at info@victory4x4.com or call us at 269-459-8447.